So the story goes that Pope Francis was on a visit to the United States, and he lands at JFK, and the Archdiocese, wanting to impress him, sends the biggest, most opulent limousine you've ever seen in your entire life. Like, literally, the thing was wrapped around a block. It was crazy. And Francis walks out of the terminal, and being who he was, he's like, there's no way. I'm not getting into this thing. He says, but you know, it's been a while since I drove, and honestly, I've always wanted to drive one. So he goes to the driver, and he says, son, I want to drive the limousine. To this kid, right? And the driver goes, Holy Father, listen, there are rules and regulations. And the Pope says, who knows about rules and regulations better than me? He says, it's going to be fine. Just let me drive it. And he says, oh, all right, fine. But where will I sit? You know, like, I can't leave the limousine. Like, if they know that I let you drive, that's it for me. So he says, listen, just sit in the back. No one's going to be any the wiser. And so Pope Francis, he convinces, Pope influences this young man who sits in the back, and the Pope merges into traffic, and about 7 minutes later is pulled over for speeding. And the cop comes up to the window, takes about half an hour to walk the length of this limousine, and the window rolls down. He says, sir, do you know how fast? And turns sheet white. Goes back to the patrol car, radios to his captain, and says, sir, I think I'm in a lot of trouble. I think I pulled over someone too important. He says, what do you mean too important? He's like, what, like the governor? He's like, much more important than that. And he says, the president? He's like, much more important than that. And he's like, who's more important than the president? And he says, I don't know, but the Pope is driving his limo. So, how do you rate that joke? I don't know if I actually think it's that good of a joke. You know, it's like, it's a good pulp. It's like, I give it about B- as a joke. But I love it. And the reason I love it is not because of what it says, but because of who said it. Because the person most recently telling that joke was Pope Francis. He wrote a column in December, just a few months before his death, about the importance of of humor in spiritual leadership. He wrote it in the New York Times. It's worth reading. I have to say that and you'll forgive me for getting personal about this, I'm very angry at the church. Not only because of the plethora of issues that I profoundly disagree with, not only because of the lack of recognition of queer relationships and just queer identity of women, of reproductive rights, but because of what they both made and allowed to happen to children, and the way that they protected the abusers and not the abused. I'll also miss Francis, because the world feels a bit like a colder and an emptier place without him. And the thing that I admired most about him, and I hope you understand that for a rabbi, it's actually important to have rabbis, even if they're a pope, you know? Because models for spiritual leadership are the kinds of things that we all have to strive for and all have to be reminded of. And the thing that I loved about Francis is that he reminded me of the simple gospel. Francis, unlike his predecessor, who was known, by the way, as Pope Benedict was known as really a master theologian. Pope Francis was known of his adherence to the simple gospel, to protect the poor, to embrace those who are ill, to speak out for the refugee, to be a friend to the friendless and a voice to the voiceless. Now, in certain ways, those statements should be the simplest thing in the entire world. Why is it so complicated to love your neighbor as yourself? And yet somehow it always is. You know this if you've had neighbors. Right, when we come down to it, if you grab someone from any religious service across the world and you sort of pull them across and you say, what are you doing here? What's the most important thing that you're doing here? And every one of them will answer to you. They'll say, love, right? This is about being a good person. And so how is it that it almost instantaneously we get away from that? The thing I admired about Francis is that he was able to voice those sentiments fight for those folks, even though he was the head of 1.3 billion people. And let me tell you, that takes some doing. Because the minute that you're in that position, even in a small way, the tides of people's emotions and belief, their love and their anger, pull you in 1,000 different directions. And he talks, by the way, in this beautiful, beautiful piece about the churchmen that he has met that have become old and bitter. He describes them, by the way, as more like old bachelors than wedded to the church. By the way, this is my litmus test for when I meet rabbis who are seniors. Because when I was a student, I met Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who in California was an absolute legend. Do you know Harold? You knew him? So I grew up in Los Angeles. It was very similar to the DC Jewish community, which is to say rich and wonderful. Right? It wasn't like New York, where everybody's Jewish, even if they're not Jewish. So New York was overwhelming. But in DC, in Los Angeles, with its 800,000 Jews, you actually felt like you knew each other. And there were lights, there were luminaries, and Rabbi Schulweis was one of them. And I met him in his 80s. And he shone like the sun. You had to put sunglasses on if you were in the room with him. The joy that shone out of his face. And for Pope Francis, that was a litmus test, right? Can you reach a stage, even in your later years as a spiritual leader, and still have pushed away the bitterness and embraced the joy? This was the test for him. And it's something that I deeply, deeply admire. The question of why it's so hard, right, to do something so simple, which is to love your neighbor, is the thing that I want to address today, because I really worry about what Francis's death means for the religious world, and to the extent that he was any sort of a check on the darker influences that have seeped into our society and our globe. Now, by the way, if you know about Francis, there was a lovely obituary for him, again in the Times, but one of the lines is that Francis was more applauded than listened to. More applauded than listened to. Which I think is true. And yet, he never shied away from saying what needed to be said. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to have a simple spirituality, a simple love? I think it's because the nature of zeal. There's 1,000 reasons, of course, but one of the reasons I want to focus on is the nature of zeal, because zeal is the thing most likely to set you out there to save the world, and often it's the reason we ruin it. You know what I mean? It's the passion that's in our heart and the idea that we need to shoot like an arrow and fix what we see to be wrong that both sends us on a mission from God and also helps us mess it up all the time. And so I think it's something about the double-edged sword of what it means to have conviction that makes it so hard to act with conviction. I've heard my entire life, because of the world I live in, wouldn't it be amazing if people could have morality without belief? Because they've seen the way that the major religions of the world have both, created something great and then not done great things with it. And yet I've never experienced morality without belief, truly. And it's a catch-22 of what it means to be human, that sometimes it's that very belief that sends the redeemers to us, as well as the people that we should be afraid of. What Francis did is something rare and important. I've used this phrase before, and I hope I'm not overusing it in this sanctuary, which is an Oliver Wendell Holmes idea that talks about simplicity on the other side of complexity. Have you heard this idea before? That whenever you first encounter something, it's simple because you don't understand it yet. And then it becomes complex because you're trying to understand it. And in fact, if you met me in my earlier years as a rabbi, you might have noticed that some of my drashes were a bit more unpalatable. What really shows mastery or understanding, grasp, kinyan, ownership, that's the word in Hebrew, is when somebody's able to say, this actually very complex thing I can relate to you simply. That's its own kind of genius. And what I admire about Francis is he was able to speak of the simplicity of taking care of the least of us the most. And this is worthwhile. By the way, I read some of his encyclicals and printed them out to bring here, and they're sitting in the printer in my wife's office, so sorry. I still have some spiritual growth of my own to do. And what I want to say to you, that what I want to ask you to do as human beings, as Jews, is to embrace that level of simplicity, even above, around, under, and beside any beliefs that you might have. Look, Francis was suspicious, apparently, of ideologies. If he smelled, if he whiffed that you were coming to him from an ideological perspective, one of the writers about him says that was it. He would just sort of call you out and he wouldn't listen to you. And I share that prejudice, if you don't mind me saying so. Because the truth is, the question about our beliefs is, are our beliefs serving humanity, or are human beings serving our beliefs? And it's so easy for that coin to flip. It's so easy for us to get into the space in which what we believe we're actually willing not just to sacrifice ourselves to, but to sacrifice other people to, even in the name of saving other people. You see how quickly it happens, how quickly the best ideas in the world go sour. And so always, always, always the litmus test should be whatever it is that we ascribe to, whatever point in the political spectrum we hold on to, whatever place in this place of spiritual belief that we hold fast to, are the ideas that we hold to, are they serving people, or are we only in service to them? And I think what Francis did is say, I am in service of humanity through God. His last encyclical, by the way, was all about the power of the human heart. For me, one of the signs of this is whether or not a spiritual leader can laugh at themselves. Because I think real humility and deep wisdom is that there are always holes in our own systems and always flaws in the way that we put ideas together. Do you know, by the way, that there is a Jewish version of the story that I told you with the limousine? It's a very famous one. No, do you know this about the Baal Shem Tov and the coachman? There's a number of coachman stories, but it goes like this. Noah would tell it better, but unfortunately, you're stuck with me. So the Baal Shem Tov had a Russian coachman whose name was Alexei. And Alexei would take him hither and thither and yon. And by the way, to be the Baal Shem Tov's coachman was not an easy thing, because he would often be moved, at the very last second, and he would say, Alexei, saddle the horses, we're going on a month-long journey, and he would say, excuse me, Rabbi, it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, do you mind if we wait until tomorrow? But no, it had to happen right then, and the relationship between the Baal Shem Tov and Alexei was very warm and very loving, according to the legends. And one day, they're making their rounds, and Alexei has been with the Baal Shem Tov the whole time. He's heard every drash, every lecture that he's ever given, so much so that he knows them by heart. And so he turns to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I know this is crazy. He says, but I've heard your teaching so much. Could I pretend to be you? And the Baal Shem Tov, who couldn't pass up that kind of opportunity to make trouble, says, yes. You can. And so at the next village, he takes the kaputa and he takes the strimal, he takes all the garb and he puts it on the coachman. The Baal Shem Tov sits at the coach, they roll into town, and they get to the yeshiva, and everyone is lauding. And the Baal Shem Tov was a controversial figure, so also not so much lauding. The Baal Shem Tov is walking in, but everyone knows this is an event, and they go into the yeshiva, and Alexei gets up there and gives the sermon, the drash, the teaching, the shir of the Baal Shem Tov, perfectly, word for word. Even the cadence and the volume, beautiful. People are just absolutely wowed. And of course, as it happens in the stories, there's a Litvak sitting in the audience. And so the Litvak gets up and he asks a question that takes about 2 or 3 minutes to get out. Abstruse and learned with citations. He had verbal footnotes. It was that kind of question. And the hush falls over the room. And the Baal Shem Tov is wondering, what is Alexei going to do? And Alexei looks at the guys and goes, that question is so simple, even my coachman can answer it. Remember that laughter is the sign of wisdom. Remember that simplicity is a sign of courage. Remember that we have to both hold on to our beliefs and let go of them. Remember that we have to admit, even to ourselves, that we aren't quite what we think, and that our convictions are not quite where we should be going. And yet we have to hold fast to them. It's hard to be human, but necessary to be kind. I will miss him. Shabbat shalom.